All right. Well, there we have it. The United States Grand Prix happened, and even though Max is already the constructors, scratch that, getting a little ahead of myself, even though he's already the drivers' championship, and people may think, oh, what's the point in the rest of the season? This race did not disappoint one bit. It was arguably one of the most exciting races this entire season, from the beginning with the Russell and Sainz crash to the end where Magnussen and Vettel were battling it out for 8th place. This race was action-packed the entire way through with crashes, safety cars, even a classic Verstappen-Hamilton battle for the win. It really brought you back to last season. Just all around such an exciting race. So we're going to break down the big points, what happened, and look at the results. Now let's get into it. Here's a look at your top 10. Obviously, Verstappen won. Him and Hamilton coming down to the end, they went for different strategies. Red Bull, obviously phenomenal with their strategies, as well as Mercedes. Ferrari has not been on top of their strategies, but Verstappen and Red Bull went with mediums towards the end of the race and an extra pit stop. Meanwhile, Hamilton and Mercedes went with hards and one less pit stop, and towards the end of the race, the hards were just giving out, didn't have the traction, didn't have the pace. Obviously, Red Bull's a faster car anyway, so Mercedes was going to be losing lap time to them, but there just wasn't enough of a gap built up, even though Red Bull had a pretty bad pit stop, which even let the Ferrari ahead, but there was no doubt that the Red Bull at this point is just faster, more pace around this circuit, so Verstappen was fairly easily able to get around Leclerc. So great job for Leclerc making up such a big gap after the penalty he had to take for the parts in his car, but there was no way he was going to be able to get around and stay in front of that Red Bull with Verstappen in it. So I think he did as good as he can, given that he started towards the back of the grid. Obviously, with Verstappen in first and Perez in fourth, they were able to secure the Constructors' Championship, which is the first one that they've had since 2013 when they last won. Literally, Mercedes has won every single Constructors since 2014. So the fact that Red Bull was able to win is huge. Is this a new Red Bull area dominance in the sport for the coming years? Who knows? It's tough because if you look at performance gain from last season, obviously there are new regulations, so it's a little different, but Red Bull still at the top of the grid, Mercedes took a step back, and Ferrari took a huge gap up. So going into next season, who knows how those cars will continue to perform with whatever changes or upgrades that the teams decide to make. It was really cool to see Hamilton and Verstappen battling it out for the top two at the end of this. It wasn't really a shock that the Red Bull would be quicker here, but Hamilton put up a really good fight. He was able to hold on for a long time. He drove extremely well, and I'm sure he was really happy that he ended up second, I believe tying his best result of the season. Good for him. I like to see him at the top because I think that's where he deserves to be, especially in a car like he has this season. Coming in second is a great achievement. We knew that Mercedes just said all of their upgrades for this race and the rest of the season, so this is as good as their car's going to get, and honestly, it seemed like it worked pretty well. As you will see, Sainz is not up here, and that is because on the first turn, reckless Russell came out of nowhere, and they collided. Whether you want to say Sainz made too sharp of a turn going onto the racing line, or Russell didn't give him enough space. Regardless, there was a collision, and Sainz had to retire. Such a shame. Started pole. He didn't get the greatest start. Verstappen definitely passed him, but you would see him up there for sure. I think he would have beat the Mercedes, and it probably would have been Verstappen 1, Sainz 2, Hamilton 3. So, real bummer for Sainz. He hasn't had the best luck at Ferrari. Leclerc hasn't had the best luck at Ferrari. Ferrari needs to get some stuff together, as now Leclerc's really fighting, and he's only a few points ahead of Perez for the second place in the Drivers' Championship, which it's crazy how that has now become a race of its own, since one is secured and now two really is up for grabs by a lot of people. Verstappen also tied the record with Sebastian Vettel and Mick Schumacher for the most wins in a season. Now, people are going to say this is because now there are more races in an F1 season, so of course, if a car and a driver is dominant, they're going to have more wins. Regardless, I'm sure Max and Red Bull is very happy to have his name up on that list. Even if there are more races, it's still a great accomplishment and just sets a new standard, especially since let's be real, Max is going to win another race before the end of the season. 3 races left, and honestly, 3 good chances that he could win. So 15 races, 1 in a season, no matter how many races are in that season, is insanely impressive. Good for Red Bull, and it shows, since driver and constructors championship, insane. The driver of the day was Sebastian Vettel, and I think that's extremely fitting, as he drove his heart out and would have came arguably 6th, as the Aston Martin was looking really, really strong the entire race. Stroll, it was a terrible situation where him and Alonso had an accident. Alonso did a wheelie, which was honestly kind of sick. Glad that they're both okay. Just some car damage. But Vettel was driving lights out. He was even leading the race at some points just because he hadn't done a pit stop yet. But regardless, it was so cool to see his name up there, especially since he won't be racing in an F1 anymore. So this was a nice little send-off, if you will, for Sebastian Vettel, except for a heartbreaking, an absolutely gut-wrenching pit stop that took him, I think, 16 seconds of stationary time, which really just destroyed all the great progress he had made, and was in 8th the entire time until he finally caught up with Kevin Magnussen, who was on hard tires finishing the race, that the tires were really going. And even Magnussen had a great race. That's for Haas coming in 8th. That's incredible. And Vettel was able to get around him, I mean, just before the finish line. Really reminds me of Bottas and Ocon finish last season, how it was just right at the line he passed him. But really great driving from Vettel. And even there was a quote from Magnussen saying that it was some of the best driving he's been a part of, and how it was really cool for him and Vettel to be battling it out. As you know, he says Vettel's one of the all-time greats, which he absolutely is. Now in some other news, Fernando Alonso, obviously in the race, he finished P7. Great drive from him, even in an accident, still able to finish P7 in the Alpine. Obviously, he's been killing it. However, the stewards deemed that his car was sent out on track in an unsafe condition. So he received a 10-second stop-and-go penalty, which converted into a 30-second time penalty after the race. This is just heartbreaking. Fernando Alonso has been doing incredible all season long, and it's really such a shame that this 30-second time penalty, I mean, that's devastating in the world of F1. Now, from what I understand, this was due to the fact that he was driving without his right mirror, I believe, and this came from a protest from Haas. However, after the race, the stewards or whoever's in charge of checking the cars to make sure the fuel regulation's all great and car safety gave it the pass and said that it was fine. So then Haas comes along saying that Alpine was unsafe. I'm assuming, why did they do this? It's toward the end of the season just to get some more points. It's not like Haas is fighting Alpine for a spot in the constructors, so I'm not exactly sure what their reasoning was. But the protest came in, and they found that it was unsafe. I think that's ridiculous. I think if after the race they check off on all the cars and say, check, this is good, this is good, this is good, then any protest launched shouldn't be a factor, and definitely should not result in this 30-second time penalty for Alonso. Such a bummer, but hey, that's the inconsistent world of F1 rules. What are you going to do? So when it comes down to this, congrats to Max for getting the 13th spot, or 13 race wins in a season. Congrats to Red Bull for getting their first constructors in a number of years since 2013. Congrats to Lewis for being P2. You deserve it. And congrats to Vettel for being up there in the race. Good for you. What a shame for Carlos Sainz. Poor dude. Poor dude. But there's always next race. You know, he did qualify pole, so that has to tell you something. But such a fun race. We'll be on this side of the globe again for Mexico, which I think is such a fun track to drive in the F1 games. I absolutely love it. So really excited to see that race. We'll see if Max can first get 14 race wins in a season, which would be incredible. And then this battle for second place in the constructors is really heating up. Leclerc is only 2 points ahead of Perez, and Russell, even if he has some phenomenal races, finishing above Leclerc and Perez, can be up in the fight as well, as he has 218 points, Perez has 265 points, and Leclerc is 267. It's really coming down to it, so cannot wait for this F1 weekend to happen. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.